May 1945. Hangars that had roared with the future of war stood suddenly silent. Pits of oil, stacks of paperwork, and wings folded under desks. The visible prize was obvious: jets, rockets, engines that no Allied Air Force had yet mastered. But the most valuable thing found in those buildings was not the metal. It was the mind sat across the table from an interpreter. What happened inside Allied interrogation rooms after the war would help decide which machines were preserved, which were destroyed, and how the jet age would be born. Allied soldiers and technicians arrived amid chaos. Records show thousands of Luftwaffe airframes were abandoned across Germany. Me-262s, Arado AR-234 reconnaissance jets, Heinkel HE-162 fighters, and the fragile, pioneering turbojet engines like the Julo 004 and BMW 003. In the hours and weeks after the German collapse, a different operation unfolded away from runways. Personnel were gathered, documents assembled, blueprints sorted, and men and women who had designed, built, flown, and maintained these machines were brought into small, windowed rooms for questioning. Those rooms became centers of technical extraction, triage, and decision. If you want more investigative history like this, subscribe and stay with us until the end. The Allied effort split into competing but overlapping missions. On the American side, Operation Lusty, officially led in the field by Colonel Harold Watson, prioritized locating, preserving, and transporting intact aircraft and the most significant components back to American test centers, such as Wright Field and Freeman Field. British teams, operating under Operation Surgeon, placed greater weight on securing German specialists, engineers, designers, and technicians, and on the transfer of knowledge to RAF Farnborough and the Royal Aircraft Establishment. The Soviet forces, meanwhile, concentrated on factories, tooling, and materials. Where front lines permitted, they moved quickly to seize industrial complexes and the personnel found within them. These differing priorities shaped what questions were asked inside Allied interrogation rooms and who was allowed to leave. To understand those rooms, imagine tentatively and carefully a converted office or hangar briefing room repurposed for a new kind of intelligence work. Allied records and after-action reports describe teams of engineers, test pilots, interpreters, and intelligence officers working together. Photographers and clerks accompanied them. Technical manuals, flight logs, maintenance notebooks, and prototype parts were placed on tables and examined under lamplight. Where the primary sources do not specify exact procedures, what follows is a plausible reconstruction drawn from documented practices. These spaces were functional, improvised, and intensely practical, laboratories for questioning rather than tribunals of guilt.
At the center of the room sat the subject, a pilot, a factory foreman, a turbomachinery specialist, or a maintenance sergeant. Facing them was a small team representing the Allied priority for that site. An RAF engineer might be there to verify airframe dimensions. A USAAF test pilot could cross-check handling notes. A translator would render German into English, and a photographer would document the manual pages and instrument panels. Records indicate that these interviews often aimed at rapid extraction of operationally useful details. How did this engine start? What were the service intervals? Which part failed most often? Where were spare parts stored? The goal was not merely historical curiosity, but immediate usability, to recreate a jet engine on a test bed, to understand a wing profile enough to copy or improve it, or to identify schematic irregularities that explained performance. Certain elements are clearly documented. Operation Lusty teams under Watson prioritized shipping whole aircraft when feasible. Reports indicate captured Me-262s and Arado AR-234s were created and transported to the United States for testing. British Operation Surgeon teams, recorded in service orders, specialized in interviewing designers and technicians and relocating select personnel and documents to the United Kingdom. The Soviets focused on disassembling factories and moving tooling east. These strategic differences influenced how interrogation rooms operated. An American team might use the interview to determine whether a machine could be safely prepared for flight and shipment. A British team might probe a designer about production methods and theoretical underpinnings. The Soviets would seek to connect the subject's testimony to wider factory inventories. What happened in a typical session, at the level of broad procedure, can be described without claiming to know the exact script of questions, which remains indefinito. A German airman would be processed, identity checks, search for documents, and a basic debrief about recent operations. From there, technical specialists could ask focused questions. If the subject had worked on jet installations, the session might zero in on engines, tolerances, lubrication practices, startup sequences, and known failure modes. Blueprints would be photographed, and small parts measured or removed for shipment. Sometimes demonstrations were arranged. A ground crewman might be asked to show how a fuel pump was stripped and reassembled. Where reports explicitly note demonstrations, they are recorded. Where they do not, the idea of live demonstrations should be treated as plausible reconstruction rather than documented fact. Language, translation, and the role of the interpreter were often decisive inside those rooms. Archived paperwork indicates teams commonly included bilingual technicians or military translators.
Records show that clarity in translation could determine whether a nuance in a German technical term was preserved or lost, and historians have noted that technical translators, not just general interpreters, were highly valued. This helps explain why British teams, which emphasized personnel, often lingered longer in interviewing designers. From these operations, list Jumo 004 and BMW 003 turbojet engines and parts, ME 262 airframe components, Arado R234 reconnaissance fuselages, and HEC 162 elements among the items cataloged for evaluation. These were not curiosities. They represented technological shortcuts into decades of research. An engine's compressor geometry or a fuel control design could save Allied engineers months or years of trial and error. So the interrogation room served as triage. Identify the most valuable intellectual capital, package it for transport, and decide what remained to be scrapped or repurposed locally. Not all exchanges were purely technical. Records show that some captured personnel were asked about operational tactics, flight routes, and unit deployments, information useful for intelligence assessments beyond engineering. Yet the priority of the room was often applied engineering. A captured maintenance manual could be as important as a designer's testimony. Photographs of documents, diagrams cut from factory manuals, and annotated maps were routine outputs of these sessions. When archives record such material being copied, we have solid evidence of the material flow from interrogation room to research laboratory. Competition was omnipresent. In central Germany, as different Allied contingents converged, access to facilities and personnel became a matter of who arrived first and carried the authority to detain or transfer. Reports recount tense moments where American, British, and Soviet units vied for the same assets. The stakes were not merely national pride. The possession of a functioning turbojet or a group of experienced engine builders could jumpstart a national program. Tensions sometimes resulted in hurried extractions, crates leaving by rail in the night, teams dismantling running examples on the spot. In other cases, political directives slowed the work. Parceling technology across Allied lines required approvals, and decisions about whether to destroy a design or keep it were subject to bureaucratic review. Inside the rooms, the lines between interrogation, debriefing, and recruitment were often blurred. Some reports describe German specialists later working under Allied auspices, contributing to post-war research. However, the precise nature of consent, the legal frameworks employed, and whether participation amounted to voluntary employment or constrained cooperation are matters where the record is incomplete and thus indefinite.
It is essential to avoid equating every transfer of expertise with a neat moral label. For some, cooperation offered a pathway to survival and professional continuity. For others, it may have been the only realistic choice in the face of occupation and displacement. The historical record confirms transfers occurred. The motivations and legalities behind each case are frequently ambiguous in primary sources. The interrogation room also served as a gate for decisions about destruction. Allied policy called for demilitarization and the removal of potential future threats. Between 1945 and 1948, thousands of aircraft were dismantled, crushed, or burned. The interrogation room's assessments played a direct role in that process. Machines identified as essential to Allied study might be crated and dispatched to Wright Field or Farnborough, while many others were consigned to the scrap pile. Local economies frequently found a reckoning there. Metal salvage became a resource for communities that had endured starvation and wreckage. In many locales, dismantling aircraft was the immediate and practical solution to a logistical overload of war material. The consequences of those choices echo in aviation history. Materials and personnel relocated to Wright Field, Freeman Field, RAF Farnborough, and other Allied centers informed early jet development. Test flights, engine bench tests, and reverse engineering projects fed into post-war military and civilian aviation programs. Records indicate direct technical lines from captured designs to prototype evaluations in the United States and the United Kingdom. The Soviets, for their part, extracted tooling and personnel that contributed to their own jet developments. The interrogation room, in other words, helped convert the physical artifacts of war into the intellectual building blocks of new air forces. Not all outcomes were immediate or tidy. Many airframes destined for preservation were damaged in transit or cannibalized for parts. Some innovations went unheralded, subsumed into broader research streams. A good deal of wartime ingenuity was lost when blueprints were incomplete or when local destruction preceded thorough documentation. Conversely, pockets of remarkably successful preservation arose. Archives, museums, and restoration efforts decades later have recovered fragments and sometimes entire aircraft, thanks to photographic records and inventories first assembled in those rooms. The survival of technical notebooks and photographs taken during post-war interrogations has proven crucial for historians and restorers seeking to understand original configurations. Ethics hovered over every table. The practical need to prevent future aggression was real. So was the desire of victorious nations to gain advantage from German technological effort. The interrogation rooms were where these objectives met human reality.
Employing a defeated specialist to rebuild a new national capability raises immediate moral questions about complicity, restitution, and the rights of individuals who had served chemical, industrial, or military programs under an authoritarian regime. Where documentation exists, it shows a spectrum of arrangements, from formal contracts and relocation offers to temporary assignments. Where the nature of consent and the specificities of recruitment are unrecorded, that absence must be acknowledged as indefinito. The political dimension extended beyond immediate logistics. Decisions made in these rooms fed into a rapidly shifting geopolitical environment. The early contours of the Cold War were beginning to form, even as the last gunfire died. Allies sometimes guarded knowledge from one another as carefully as from former enemies. Classified reports and shipment logs testified to restricted access. In other instances, shared evaluations were part of cooperative efforts among Western allies. The interrogation room was where tactical intelligence became strategic advantage. It is important to avoid two common missteps in interpreting this history. The first is sensationalization, the temptation to imagine interrogation rooms as secret laboratories full of coercion and illicit techniques. The evidence does not support a uniform pattern of illegal interrogation. The second is sanitization, presenting every German specialist as an unproblematic beneficiary of Allied assistance. The truth is more ambivalent, shaped by survival needs, the pressure of occupation, and the urgent politics of the moment. The primary sources show what was done. What was uncertain, they leave unresolved. Across Europe and into the United States, the technical fruits of interrogation room work rippled outward. Measured evaluations of captured jets influenced test programs and training syllabi. Engine tolerances and material compositions, gleaned from manuals and testimony, sped up the process of designing reliable turbojets for Allied use. The conceptual leap, from reactive study to proactive development, depended on the raw information assembled in those small rooms. Diagrams photographed, parts measured, questions answered. There were also costs. Mass scrapping erased entire classes of airframes that, had they survived, might today fill museum hangars in greater numbers. The dismantling of factories and shipping of tooling to the east and west altered local economies and the trajectories of regional industry. The interpersonal cost, for technicians compelled to work under new authorities or to leave homeland families, is harder to quantify but is no less real. In the decades since, historians, restorers, and museums have pieced together fragments from those interrogations. Surviving notebooks, photographs, and shipment lists have allowed researchers to reconstruct engine assemblies and airframe details.
Restoration projects sometimes rely precisely on the documentation that was prepared in the immediate aftermath of the war. The irony is clear. Where metal was crushed, a photograph or a typed memorandum taken in a cold interrogation room might be the last remaining technical trace, and that trace has been enough to recreate a small part of aviation history. As we consider the interrogation rooms, it helps to remember their physical modesty. These were not grand halls of decree. They were converted classrooms, dim offices, and partitioned hangar nooks where the future of flight was argued over tea and in clipped technical language. They were pragmatic spaces, shaped by the urgency of the moment, where men in uniform and civilian engineers tried to salvage usable knowledge from the wreckage of war. The story of what transpired inside those rooms is a story of translation, literal and figurative. Translators rendered language. Technicians translated blueprints into working test plans. Authorities translated intelligence into policy. What to ship, whom to detain, which factories to seize. Those translations were imperfect and sometimes contested, but they were decisive. The jet age did not spring fully formed. It was assembled piece by piece, paragraph by paragraph, testimony by testimony, in modest rooms across a defeated Germany. We do not have a full inventory of every question ever asked in those chairs. Much remains undefined, but what we can say with confidence is that these rooms were a hinge. The decisions made there directed where machines would go, determined which experts would continue to shape aeronautics, and set boundaries on what would be erased. Their work was technical, urgent, often anonymous, and ultimately transformative. In the end, the hangars emptied, and the machines were moved, salvaged, or cut apart. The physical presence of the Luftwaffe diminished, but the knowledge extracted in interrogation rooms and catalogued in piles of photographs and reports persisted. That knowledge did not belong to any single nation. It fed into competing programs, civilian and military, East and West. The interrogation room, for all its modesty, was one of the quiet theaters in which the future of aviation was quietly decided. If this account raised questions for you about where those captured technologies ended up, or what became of the men and women who spoke in those rooms, check out our next video, What Happened to German U-Boats After World War II? And if you want more deep dives like this one, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our weekly explorations into the hidden corners of history.